The beginning of life without Roger Waters for Pink Floyd starts with this record in 1987. Phase 3 of Pink Floyd, if you will. This is David Gilmour, Richard Wright and Nick Mason's record, arguably closer to a David Gilmour solo record. This is a Momentary Lapse of Reason from 1987. And straight out of the park here, I will say that A Momentary Lapse of Reason is not my favourite Pink Floyd album. It is within that B tier, I would say, for Pink Floyd. It is not close to the 73 to 79 records, but the key is it is still a worthwhile, worthy Pink Floyd album. And I've taken this time to talk about A Momentary Lapse of Reason because in the last week I've decided to revisit this album, see if there's any spark, any life left that can get this album higher up in my Pink Floyd rankings. So let's see. Sit back and I'll tell you all about what I thought about this album in the last week, my reflections on it from the start, from when I first heard it, and what I think of A Momentary Lapse of Reason now. A Momentary Lapse of Reason is an album that I would say I have always overlooked with Pink Floyd, purely because of the quality of albums that came before it. When I was discovering Pink Floyd back in 2018, 2019, there were 4 records that were very, very special to me. And normally I'm a contrarian when it comes to these things. Normally I'll go with something that other people don't like, not necessarily the favourite album. There is a bit of contrarianism, if you can call it that, in that my favourite album of Floyd's is The Wall. That's very much a Marmite album. Some people love it, some people hate it. But between maybe a 12-month period, I spent a lot of time digesting those 4 albums. I think I started with The Dark Side of the Moon. The Dark Side of the Moon, then Wish You Were Here, and then Animals. I think The Wall was the last, so I did go through these records chronologically. The Wall was the one that I spent the most time with. The Wall really took months of my life up because that was the album for the very first time that consumed me. There have been a few albums after that have done, but nothing to the case beforehand. And I can say that about Pink Floyd's music in general. Before Pink Floyd, my favourite bands might have been AC/DC, Thin Lizzy, and it almost feels strange to me because I consider Pink Floyd to be one of my favourite bands. I think on some days I could say they are my favourite band. But there were only 5 records by Pink Floyd, which I like a lot. And in my logical head, that feels a little bit strange because it's an artist, a band that there are some periods of the band that I'm not that keen of or haven't discovered for myself, haven't really gone out and looked at that early period, that Syd Barrett period, that period where they were finding themselves a little bit more resourceful as Secrets, Atom Heart Mother and Medal, even Obscured by Clouds. I've listened to that once but not gone through that much afterwards. So after the 79 album, The Wall, there were a couple of songs on this that were rather at the time part of that rotation for Pink Floyd. I guess that maybe I was listening on Spotify or a Greatest Hits album. I can't quite remember what it was, but a couple of the songs that I listened to from this album when I was first discovering Pink Floyd were Learning to Fly and On the Turning Away, which both of them I thought were great songs and blended fine into the rest of the catalogue. But I think with Pink Floyd, it is a lot for me about those first 4 albums. I always think that what Pink Floyd achieved in those first 4 albums between 1973 and 1979. So here I'm talking about The Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals and The Wall. What the band achieved on those 4 albums, I think many bands would be happy to achieve throughout their whole career. I think sometimes when I play these albums that Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals and The Wall, in whatever order, whatever configuration, could be my 4 favourite albums of all time. Such is how good all of those albums are. I would probably rank them in reverse of when they were released. I'd put The Wall top, Animals second, Wish You Were Here third, and The Dark Side of the Moon fourth, which feels a little bit harsh on Wish You Were Here because that is such a brilliant, brilliant album. Such is The Dark Side of the Moon as well. But there is a strange period after that, which has The Final Cut. Again, an album which I've listened to a couple of times, tried to go back, and there hasn't really been that spark. A Momentary Lapse of Reason, this album, which again, I've listened to a couple of times, not had that spark to go and really dive deep into it. And then there's The Division Bell. And The Division Bell is that 5th album that I was alluding to earlier. That album that I think at one point maybe stood side by side with those 4 albums from 73 to 79. Well, why is that? I think that The Division Bell has a real clear theme. There are some real clear themes on Dark Side Up to the Wall. And I think that the final cut is just a little bit too much of a moody record. I'll talk about Momentary Lapse of Reason, not to give anything away. But the Division Bell, that is very much a record about communication. And the Division Bell, the phrase itself, sums that up perfectly. And I think that that album keeps my interest because it is not just a collection of singular songs, like the albums before aren't a collection of singular songs. This album, however, A Momentary Lapse of Reason, feels a little bit more to me like a collection of songs without anything really holding them together apart from the fact that they are on this album, A Momentary Lapse of Reason, and perhaps the production values that make these songs link together and sound somewhat similar. But as I said before, these songs blended fine, at least the two that I'd referenced earlier, into Pink Floyd's other output. I enjoyed listening to them. Indeed, the live shows that they did around this point, I feel like the later material blends fine with some of the material from earlier from Pink Floyd. This is a different sound in Pink Floyd. This is very much now David Gilmour's band. In the later years that Roger Waters was in Pink Floyd, he really took the reins. Animals, The Wall, and then the final cut was basically a Roger Waters solo record, with some help from David Gilmour. But this was now David Gilmour's band, in a way that with my favourite bands, I only get that feeling from perhaps Dire Straits. That Mark Knopfler is the front man, Mark Knopfler is the man, and that perhaps sounds selfish and harsh on the other members of the band, and possibly a little bit naive from me. But this record in particular, I don't necessarily get that same feeling with the Division Bell. This is David Gilmour's band. This is more of a David Gilmour solo album that is on display here. But the elements of Pink Floyd that made them so good in the 70s was that blend of Roger Waters and David Gilmour. Roger Waters with that real lyrical pull, whether it was dreamy lyrics, whether it was emotional lyrics, or whether it was just really gritty lyrics, the likes of what we saw on Animals, and those feelings of isolation on The Wall. The lyrics aren't necessarily here this time out to really compel me to go and listen further, but those guitar solos are from David Gilmour. Those guitars are still here, and the guitars are best on this album when they are really deep, dark and crunching, like on Signs of Life, the first song, which is an instrumental building up to the entire piece, which I find some comparison to that with One of These Days, the instrumental from Medal, in that it's just brooding and building up a little bit, and there's a hint of that real crushing guitar that comes in at some point. We see that later in the album in Sorrow as well, which is the last song on A Momentary Lapse of Reason. But I've never done a deep dive on this, never picked to listen to this. This isn't an album that, if I've got all the Pink Floyd albums lined up, A Momentary Lapse of Reason isn't the one that I would naturally pick. But for some reason this week I did. Maybe because I'd like to get to know it more, and maybe because when I look at the songs on the back of this CD, I know the first half pretty well. Learning to Fly, The Dogs of War, One Slip and On the Turning Away. The second half I'm far less familiar with. We've got Yet Another Movie, Round and Round, A New Machine Parts 1 and 2, and Terminal Frost. But I know Sorrow quite well. So returning to it this time, what do I think of A Momentary Lapse of Reason? Much the same as what I thought before. I think the big takeaway from this, actually, for me, is that the first side in particular, the first half of this album in particular, is very solid. What you have to accept going into this album, if you are somebody who has listened to the 73 to 79 records, this ain't that Pink Floyd anymore. Much is the Syd Barrett Pink Floyd, and the Waters-Gilmour Pink Floyd, and then the Waters Pink Floyd, and then this David Gilmour Pink Floyd. None of those are the same. There are some connections, there are things that sound a little bit similar, but this is a different Pink Floyd, and I think to be able to enjoy this album, you have to get past that. There's no Roger Waters here. The lyrics maybe aren't as compelling. Roger Waters called them B-rate. I'm not so sure about that. I think Roger Waters at this point was very bitter about the breakup of Pink Floyd. But the first half of this album is very solid. The first half of this album plays more into the arena rock sound that Pink Floyd would develop with their tours that came up. They had the Delicate Sound of Thunder tour, and they had Pulse, both of which were live CDs and DVD releases. But there's a nice mixture of songs on this first side as well. Learning to Fly, I think, is probably the most well-known song on this album. It's a great crushing hard rock song. Well, hard rock may be going a little bit far, but it's a rock song with still those progressive leanings. But what's still great in this, that it's got an almost on the run quality from Dark Side of the Moon, with that spoken word in the sort of the midsection of that song, with getting ready to fly, getting ready for flight. And I think Nick Mason was learning to fly at this point. That's what the inspiration for this song was, and a song that I've always loved over the years when I've heard it. The Dogs of War is one that I can probably give or take, really, or take or leave rather. But it still has some good qualities to it. That saxophone, the fact that the tempo changes, so it's not just a one-dimensional Pink Floyd song. One Slip is more of I would say, melodic Pink Floyd song, a song that perhaps you wouldn't have seen previously, but it's a real good song in, again, that 80s production value mindset, really. On the Turning Away is much more of a ballad, and that makes a nice change from what's come already on the album. And a couple of songs that I'd recommend to go and check out from this album if you haven't heard it before are probably Learning to Fly and One Slip. On the Turning Away is a great one as well, but I think somebody who might not have heard Pink Floyd before at all, those two are a really good place to start. A really nice entry point, I would think, to Pink Floyd. The same thing still applies on me revisiting this album, in that the second side isn't that memorable. Even after listening to it a few times, I struggled to remember it that much. And I think the reason for that is that Terminal Frost is an instrumental. I don't think there's that much vocal on Yet Another Movie, Round and Round and Then a New Machine Parts 1 and Part 2. And it's because of that lag towards the end of the album. Perfectly listenable, perfectly good background noise, but not as cohesive. It doesn't have the wow factor that previous albums do to pull you in for the entire duration. Wish You Were Here is a classic example of an album that has drift, that has long instrumental sections on Shine On You, Crazy Diamond, but I'm able to just sit there and enjoy the music the same as on Animals, with those long songs, with those instrumental sections, that I'm able to just bask in the great musicianship. I don't feel the same here, and even after a couple of listens, it's still not there. This is less cohesive than those albums. I'm willing to give those previous albums time, because I can spend time thinking about the feelings, the themes on this album, what's going on those albums. That doesn't feel the same on the Momentary Lapse of Reason, because unless there's something that I'm missing that is explicit here, apart from the great album cover, in fairness, Floyd often had very good album covers, there's nothing really to keep me interested in the second side. That being said, Sorrow is a great closer with a real dark guitar opening, and then a great following on from that. So very solid end to the album. But because it's still unfamiliar to me, I could go and listen to this again and again. I don't think I'm going to choose to, because there hasn't been enough to give me that spark to go and listen again. I think to be able to listen to an album again and again and really enjoy it, you have to have that spark. And even after a couple of listens, the first side is really good. I think if there was a continuation of that going into the second side, it would be a great album. There isn't enough of that. And there is certainly enough of that on the Division Bell. That's why I would say that is almost a A- tier album, if you will. It doesn't quite hit the same as the 73 to 79 albums, but that is more of an A- album. I don't know if it's the 80s production values. I don't think it is necessarily that. I just think it's the drift that goes on in that second side, which makes me lose interest a little bit. There are some great moments, great guitar noodling going on, but not too much really to keep me interested. And I think that this album is more in your face than previous records, which is great on the first side because it has that arena rock feeling, that exciting feeling. Even that, though, in the Dogs of War dissipates a little bit. But on the second side, it's not really there. Now, there is a remastered or a remixed version of this album that I believe does remove some of that 1980s sound, but I've never listened to that, and I don't really have a inkling to go and listen to that. I would rather just hear A Momentary Lapse of Reason in the guise that it is originally. But I've tried to go and revisit this album. I've given it a good go, and I think that is the main thing, and I wanted to just share my thoughts about what I think of A Momentary Lapse of Reason now. I believe that this is a B tier Pink Floyd album. It is still a worthy Pink Floyd album, a lot of which because of that first side of music. Signs of Life is a good album opener if you're listening to this as an album, but as single songs, Learning to Fly, The Dogs of War is good, but maybe not as good as the rest is on side one. One Slip, and then I think actually On the Turning Away and Sorrow are more of a return to older Pink Floyd. But the rest of it, I don't care about as much, certainly as I do the previous record. So that is A Momentary Lapse of Reason from 1987. If you haven't heard this for a while like me, go and give it a spin. If you haven't heard it at all, and you've either heard the best Pink Floyd albums, if you will, those classic Pink Floyd albums, and haven't heard this before, or indeed you are somebody who's never heard anything of Pink Floyd before, and I think if you're the latter, thank you for tuning in, especially for this period, to see what I think of this record. But go and listen to it yourself. If you don't want to listen to the whole thing, those couple of songs, Learning to Fly and One Slip, are definitely the ones to go and check out. But A Momentary Lapse of Reason, at nearly 40, is still a B-tier Pink Floyd record, and I think it's going to take a lot for me to move it up to that A tier. But interesting enough anyway to go and revisit A Momentary Lapse of Reason. We need to do these cleansing bits sometimes, don't we? To go and revisit an album, give it a try. They're not all going to work out, but I still have lots of fun listening to A Momentary Lapse of Reason. So if you've enjoyed that little bit of a roundup of what I thought of A Momentary Lapse of Reason over the last week, make sure to leave a like down below. Comment your thoughts. I'm really interested to see what you think of this album. Has your opinion changed over the years, particularly if you were around for this album coming out at the time, because a lot of time had passed between 79 and 87. I'm going to take the final cut out of the equation here, from The Wall sound to A Momentary Lapse of Reason, whereas for me, I was listening to this album pretty much straight after listening to The Wall, and even after all these years have passed now, around 7 years, which is about the gap between The Wall and A Momentary Lapse of Reason, I think I'd rather still stick with those albums beforehand. But I could say that for a lot of albums from other artists, because those other albums are so good. So is it just because those albums are so good that makes this less listenable? Or is it this record itself? I'll leave you that one to ponder on. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you again soon for more music content. Thank you for your company, and I'll see you again soon. Goodbye for now.